All right, let's dive into one of the most important parts of the Indian Constitution, your fundamental rights. Seriously, think of these as your personal shield, a powerful protection that every single citizen has against the power of the state. So let's start with a really big question. I mean, what really stops a government from getting too powerful, from just doing whatever it wants? It's a question people have been grappling with for centuries, and the answer is at the very core of what we're talking about today. And that answer right there is fundamental rights. But here's the magic word, enforceable. See, these aren't just nice suggestions or lofty ideas on a piece of paper. They are legally binding guarantees. If someone, even the government, violates one of your fundamental rights, you can walk straight into a court and demand justice. That's what gives them their teeth. Okay, so what are these incredible guarantees? Well, the Constitution lays out 6 core rights that are basically the bedrock of our democracy. Let's break them down. Here they are. The 6 pillars. You've got the right to equality, which means no discrimination, the right to freedom, which includes things like freedom of speech. Then there's the right against exploitation and the freedom to practice your religion. And check out that last one, the right to constitutional remedies. That one's the real game changer. It's the right that gives you the power to enforce all the other rights. It's like the key that unlocks the entire shield. Now, a quick fun fact, you might hear people say there were originally 7 fundamental rights, and they'd be right. The right to property used to be on this special list, but it was eventually moved because it was creating some roadblocks for social reforms, like distributing land. It still exists, mind you, but now it's a legal right, not a fundamental one. It's a small change in wording, but a huge difference in power.
You know, these rights didn't just appear out of thin air. They're actually the product of a long, often difficult global struggle for freedom. So let's take a quick trip back in time to see how we got here. This story really kicks off way back in 1215 in England with the Magna Carta, the first time a king was basically forced to put limits on his own power. Then you fast forward to 1789 and the French Revolution, which just exploded with modern ideas about liberty. For India, a huge moment was in 1928 with the Motilal Nehru Report, which was basically our first formal demand for a Bill of Rights from the British. And all of that history, all that struggle, led to 1950, when India's own Constitution was born, putting in place one of the most detailed lists of fundamental rights the world had ever seen. And those 3 little words from the French Revolution, liberty, equality, fraternity, they're so much more than just a catchy slogan. They are literally the philosophical DNA that's woven right into our Constitution and the rights we're talking about today. Okay, so we know what these rights are and a little bit about where they came from, but how do they actually function in the real world? And, this is really important, do they have any limits? Here's what gives fundamental rights their super status. So if a regular legal right is violated, you usually have to start at the bottom and work your way up the court system. But if a fundamental right is violated, you get an express ticket. You can go straight to the Supreme Court. That's a huge deal. It puts these rights in a league of their own. But, and this is a really big but, these rights aren't a free-for-all. They aren't absolute. For example, your freedom of speech doesn't give you the right to put national security at risk. The government can impose what it calls reasonable restrictions for the sake of the public good, whether that's for security, public morality, or even just keeping good relations with other countries. It's always a delicate balancing act. So that brings us to a really fascinating question. If these rights are so, well, fundamental, can the government just change them? Can Parliament vote to take them away? For decades, this very question was at the heart of a huge legal showdown in India. And you can literally see this legal tug-of-war playing out here. In 1965, the Supreme Court said, yep, Parliament can change anything. Then, just 2 years later, in the Golaknath case, they did a complete 180 and said, nope, fundamental rights are sacred and can't be touched. The rules kept changing, creating total confusion, until this massive landmark case in 1973, Kesananda Bharti, which finally came up with a brilliant compromise. And that compromise is called the Basic Structure Doctrine. Think of it like the ultimate constitutional safety net. It says, okay, Parliament, you can amend the Constitution, you can even amend fundamental rights, but you cannot destroy its core identity. You can't get rid of democracy, you can't get rid of secularism. It was revolutionary. The judiciary basically drew a line in the sand and said to Parliament, your power ends here. This doctrine makes sure the soul of the Constitution can never be taken away. So what's the bottom line? Well, the story of our rights isn't finished.
It's not some dusty old book on a shelf. It's a living, breathing conversation that's constantly evolving. I mean, just look at the debates happening right now. In this digital age, people are talking about a right to be forgotten, the right to have old, maybe embarrassing personal info wiped from the internet. The founders of the Constitution could never have imagined something like that. But here we are, figuring it out.
And that kind of brings us to the final thought here. The rights we have today were born from our past. But as our society and our technology change faster than ever, you have to wonder, what rights will be considered fundamental tomorrow? What new shields will the next generation need? It's a conversation that every single one of us is a part of. Thanks for joining this explainer.